And I mean, you said it's going to be a easy stuff, and I would say that today's meeting will be easier than the last one. It's not going to be so heavy or so theoretical. It's really concrete stuff about Israel sociology and Israel ideological makeup, I would say, and it perhaps is one of the most relevant and urgent issues on Israel's agenda. I mean, a lot of the current protests for and against or struggle about the judicial overhaul is about religion and state, is about the tension between different parts of the Israeli public concerning religion and state. So that's really what we're going to talk about. And so let me share my presentation, and I want to start with the following notice, the following flyer put up in 1933 in Tel Aviv. This is it's called a municipal notice number 36, right? And the headline here is against the desecration of Sabbath in public. And I'm going to read just the last few sentences of this municipal notice, right, from 1933. It says, remember, it's on the right over here, remember that the Sabbath is the greatest historical symbol of national solidarity, and anyone who harms it harms the unity of Israel. We hope that the cultured and mature public of our city will note our request and not cause quarrels between brothers by desecrating the Sabbath in public. Okay. Signed Meir Dizengoff, Tel Aviv's first Jewish mayor, or first mayor, of course. Tel Aviv was a Jewish city from its inception. And this, I'm bringing this as something that, of course, is long gone in its relevancy for Israel and for the Israeli public. Tel Aviv would not put out a notice like that, not in a million years today, but it says something important about what happened, what Tel Aviv was once, and what the atmosphere for secular people in Tel Aviv was once. And I want to jump straight from here to today's Tel Aviv and show you this ad from today, saying, I'm translating it, on Friday we are placing a red line on religious coercion. Come at 2 p.m. to one of the stations on the list, demonstrate on the platform of the station, and about 4, you will board the train, the last train to Neve Tzedek from Tel Aviv, from central Tel Aviv, and we will then provide for lifts back. And this then is an ad for a demonstration. This Friday, red line here is a play on words. The red line is the first metro line opened in Israel, in Tel Aviv today. Just today, this sort of municipal light train line opened. It's called the red line, but they're saying we're putting a red line on religious coercion because the red line is not working on the Sabbath. And here we have an issue of a municipal public transportation project that has cost hundreds of millions of shekels, that has been in the planning and in the building for decades, for literally decades. This is the first municipal such public transportation conveniency in Tel Aviv, right? We don't have an underground metro. So, and it will not operate a seventh of the time, right? So people are demonstrating against this. And of course, in Tel Aviv, almost all residents are secular. So there's no real reason not to operate it on the Sabbath. So this is from today. And I want to show you a few more objects just before we dive into the material. These are 2 tweets that I've translated by Google Translated from before the second round of elections, right? And on the top left corner is Aryeh Deri, right, the head of the Shas, Ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, saying, on Tuesday, Israel is going to a referendum on whether to be a Jewish state or a secular state. Give an answer at the ballot box. And at the bottom right, we have Yossi Elito, which is an editor of the most popular ultra-Orthodox, Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox magazine, the Mishpacha, right? It's also in English. And he says, the upcoming elections are a kind of a referendum between believing Jews and assimilating Jews, between traditionalists and haters of religion, between those who adhere to the idea of Israel's eternity will not lie, and those who advocate the path of, like all the Gentiles, the house of Israel. Let's pray that the good will win, right? So this is presenting Israel's election. This is the second round out of 5, right? As a struggle between secular Jews and religious Jews, indeed between real Jews and heretical, non-observant Jews. This is the level of, I would say, anxiety and cultural warfare that has enveloped Israel over the last 2 years and over the last rounds of elections. So bear this also in mind. And finally, I want to show you this. This is an article, an op-ed in Haaretz from not less than a year ago. Ram Froman, who heads what he calls the Secular Forum, it's a NGO, says that, I'm translating the headline, we, the secular people, are a denomination, or how do you say migzar? I'm sorry, I forgot the word, are a part of another part of society just like any other. It is our time for autonomy. And in the caricature here, you see a flag written, the state of Tel Aviv on it. And these are the secular Jews fending off, protecting themselves from the desert around. Okay, so this is how serious this issue is in Israel, how this issue can tear apart society in Israel and is tearing it apart right now, the issue of religion and state. And I gave the heading to this presentation, the end of the status quo. So what is the status quo? And I want to begin with that, and then I have another presentation. This is also from today. This is actually today's international edition of the New York Times headline, a push for sex segregation in Israel. This is today's paper. Okay, so what's happening? What is Israel religion and state status quo? The status quo is a name given to an agreement between David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, and Agudat Israel, the then 1947 biggest ultra-Orthodox organization. On the 19th of June 47, Ben-Gurion sent a letter to the ultra-Orthodox Agudat Israel party promising 4 things. And here, these are direct quotes, translated obviously, of the letter Ben-Gurion sent Agudat Israel, the ultra-Orthodox organization. So what did Ben-Gurion promise them? And this is, right, this is less than a year before the establishment of the state of Israel. Ben-Gurion says to them, Sabbath, clearly the official day of rest in the Jewish state will be the Sabbath. Kosher, we will do the best we can to ensure every state kitchen meant to be used by Jews will be kosher. State kitchen, he means governmental institutes, police, army, etc. Family laws, we will do everything possible in order to satisfy the deep need of keepers of religion to prevent a split of the house of Israel into 2. What does that mean? I'm not going to go into all the details. It basically means that marriage and divorce for Jews in Israel will be held in and only in or by the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. If you're a Jew, you can only get married with an Orthodox rabbi in an Orthodox chuppah in Israel and get divorced through a Beit Din, an Orthodox Beit Din with 3 Dayanim, Orthodox rabbis who grant you the divorce. So that's the only way Jews can marry, and that's for, he says, not to split the house of Israel into two. So I mean, there's a lot of halachic details in. Basically, it means so the observant of the halacha will not fear that the secular are perhaps mamzerim, perhaps halachic bastards, as it were. That's basically what he means here. And then education, a full autonomy of every branch of education will be promised. Okay, so ultra-Orthodox and indeed religious Zionists will have their own branches of education. So this is what Ben-Gurion promises Agudat Israel, the ultra-Orthodox organization, before the State of Israel is founded. And the question is why? Why? Why does Ben-Gurion promise these things? I mean, Ben-Gurion and the secular socialist Zionists, the labor movement of that time, APAI, had a complete hegemony in Israel. They held complete political power. They didn't even need a coalition at that time. I mean, the secular left within itself had a few parties, but they themselves could form any government they wanted. Why? Why did Ben-Gurion do it? So the answer given in research, and it holds truth, is that Ben-Gurion needed Agudat Israel before the establishment of the state for them to not to ruin the opinion of the United Nations about whether the Jews are liable, are responsible enough, are willing to have a state of their own. This is June 47. Remember that in November 47, the United Nations will decide to grant the Jews and the Arabs in Israel their legitimate independence, right? On the 29th of November 47, the United Nations will pass a decree calling for two states in the land of Israel instead of the British mandate, a Jewish and an Arab state. And before that, the United Nations, sends emissaries to Israel to talk to the natives, right? To see whether it's, when the British fold their flags and ship off, will there be someone to be handed the keys, as it were, to the place? So Ben-Gurion doesn't want the ultra-Orthodox to tell the to tell the UN, no, we don't want a Jewish state at all. We're waiting for the Messiah, and we are not, in the opinion of these heretics, these Jewish infidels, that we need a state. We're waiting for the Messiah. He doesn't want that to happen. So that's one important reason why Ben-Gurion says this to, or promises the status quo agreement to the ultra-Orthodox. But I would say there's another reason. The other reason, which is an important reason, is that the labor movement, the socialist secular Zionists, did not have a clear answer to many important Jewish questions. They did not, as an example, have a way to marry, to engage in matrimony in a secular socialist Zionist way. They didn't think of a way to get married. They didn't think of a way to get married in a secular way. They didn't think of a way to engage in many of the central points in a person's life, birth, marriage, death, etc. And in those points, they still needed the ultra-Orthodox to officiate, as it were, ceremonies, to do the stuff that you do when these things happen. So, and all that was also connected to the fact that they needed these symbols as part of their identity, as part of their Jewish identity, as part of their claim to be authentically continuing the Jewish tradition. Now, they were secular Jews, they were proudly secular, they rejected the halakha, and they even thought that the ultra-Orthodox and the observant will be soon disappearing from the map of Jewish life. But they still needed some of these things as symbols of national continuity with the Jewish people of old. And here I remind you the municipal notice in Tel Aviv. The Sabbath was a symbol for these people. They needed it to, as it were, for themselves, be authentically continuing the Jewish people. Okay? So these two reasons are at the base of Ben-Gurion's agreement with Agudat Israel, with the Ultra-Orthodox, about the status quo. And I want now to show you how the status quo rose and how it then declined over the course of Israel's history. So I'm going to go point by point, except for, for the first 3 points, I'm not going to go into educational issues, not much happened there. Sabbath, kosher, and marriage. What happened in these issues over the 75 years of Israel's existence? So let's begin with Sabbath struggles. 1951, Israeli labor law is legislated, forbidding work on the Sabbath for Jews, except for emergency services. The Minister of Interior Affairs has the authority to authorize some work done in the Sabbath, but that's the law. In 1965, Edison Cinema in Jerusalem is torched for selling tickets on the Sabbath. Notice that the movie itself was not shown on the Sabbath, but tickets were sold before the Sabbath was out, right? The movie was to be shown in Motzei Shabbat, in the Sabbath evening, which is not Shabbat, but the tickets were sold in Sabbath, and the cinema is in flames. In 1976, the government falls after reception ceremony for the F-15s is held on Friday afternoon. These are F-15s given or sold by the United States, of course. They are flown to Israel on Friday. They land in Israel on Friday afternoon. Members of the government are receiving them, are in the reception party for the F-15s, and the ceremony is held on Friday afternoon, and the ministers and the prime minister, which is Yitzhak Rabin in his first government, cannot get back home in time without desecrating the Sabbath. That causes a stir in the government, and the government basically falls apart. That's not the only reason it fell apart, but it's a major reason for it. The government falls apart, and we have an election, and in 1977, as we know, Begin and the Likud claim power for the first time. 1984, the struggle to open Heichal Cinema in Petach Tikva. This is a civic struggle to open one cinema on the Sabbath in Petach Tikva. In Tel Aviv, there are already 1 or 2 cinemas open on the Sabbath, but Petach Tikva also wants, it's a big city beside Tel Aviv or alongside Tel Aviv. It wants to open a cinema. There's a big civic struggle, ultra-Orthodox against secular people. Zehava Galon, if you know, was the head of Meretz party. She began her political career there. At the end, Heichal opens on the Sabbath for the first cinema in Petach Tikva to be open on the Sabbath. 1987, 1994, struggles concerning the closing of major roads in Jerusalem on the Sabbath. The road called Bar Ilan, Ramot Road. Ultra-Orthodox are demanding that these roads that are passing close to their neighborhoods be closed. There's struggles around it. There's a sort of a compromise at the end. I'm not going to get into it. And then in 1999, the government breaks up because of transferring part of an electric turbine on the Sabbath. The government doesn't fall, but the Ultra-Orthodox Party withdraw from the Barak government because an electric turbine was shuffled along the road on the Sabbath in order not to create a traffic jam if it would be shuffled in one of the weekdays. So, as you can see, the Sabbath was always a contentious subject in Israel with severe political repercussions for governmental breaking of the Sabbath in public. Kosher legislation. 1962, pork law prohibits the raising, keeping, and slaughtering of pigs in Israel. Right? This law did not prohibit selling of pork in Israel, so you can import meat, pork, and sell it, but you cannot raise pigs in Israel. So this law has had a few loopholes, which secular kibbutzim knew how to use and raise pigs, but that's the law. In 1980, the Chief Rabbinate law states that only it has permission to administer kosher certificates to businesses and has a copyright on the word kosher. This is true till this day. The Chief Rabbinate has a copyright on the word kosher. You cannot write this cafe or this restaurant is kosher without getting an official certificate from the Chief Rabbinate. So that passes in 1980. 1981, a law is suggested by the religious parties aimed to prohibit selling pork, failing to get legislated. Another attempt at the above is tried in 1985. So this is an attempt to forbid selling of pork in Israel, right? 1986, Chametz law prohibits displaying and selling chametz on Passover. This is true till this day. Chametz, you cannot legally sell chametz on Passover. It's done, but it's considered illegal. And in 2023, just a few months ago, an amendment to the chametz law prohibits displaying chametz on Passover in hospitals. And this is a great issue that was debated over the last election. Indeed, one of the MKs disbanding the former government, the Lapid-Bennett government, said that she was withdrawing from the government because it did not respect the sensitivities of religious people in hospitals. This law basically says that if you are hospitalized on Passover, you cannot bring in food that is chametz to the hospital. You cannot bring in your sandwich with you if you're in the ER, right? If you're in the emergency room, right? Don't leave the sandwich outside. And even people who are coming to visit you cannot bring chametz into the hospital. And this is, again, obviously because of this infringement of people's privacy, this was an issue and still is an issue. The amendment was legislated in the current government to indeed to enforce this, and you should take it as part of the great cultural war going on or struggle going on at this time in Israel about these issues. Now I want to show you something about the pork law. This is a few passages from Natan Alterman's weekly column at that time in the Var newspaper in Israel. This is from 1956. Okay, and I have it translated, right? And I want to read it. Natan Alterman was perhaps the national poet at that time, secular Tel Avivian Jew, and he's talking about the pork law, and this is 1956. I'm going to read this. I frowned. No, freedom, brother, cannot be divided. And the pen said to me, here, poet writer, perhaps it's the landscape of this country, or the landscape of the people's history, or the silly words in the writings of the witty. But the lover of freedom will not deny that it would be a little strange to meet Jewish pig farms on the way up, let's say, to the holy city. It seems that in the heart of every nation, and doubly so in this nation and in this landscape that was the cradle thereof, there are memories of certain aversions that were carved with sword and whip and imprinted as an itch that is unconscious. That is why even those who do not distinguish between the split hooves and the not split hooves feel that when the Hebrew nation makes the pig into an inalienable principle, a tremor presses through its history. Because the reasoning of the religious and the secular society and its reasoning seem to complement each other at this instance. A bit strange, but it's hard to ignore that on the one hand religion, and on the other hand a bit of ancient geography and a bit of lengthy history, the position of the pig back in the middle is indeed a bit uncomfy. Natan Alterman, again, the national poet at that time, is positive towards the forbidding of raising and slaughtering of pigs in Israel. And he's saying, look, I'm for religious freedom, but here, let's make an exception. The pig or pork has such a symbolic meaning in the history of the Jewish people. Here, I think we should make an exception and allow for this law to be passed and for pork to be prohibited in Israel. I'm bringing this as another evidence, another testimony of how national symbols based on religious observances were important for the secular socialist Zionist hegemony at the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel. Okay, now let's continue with marriage legislation. Okay. 1953, rabbinical court's law states that Jews can only get married and divorced through the Chief Rabbinate's rabbinical courts in Israel. 1963, the Supreme Court's verdict instructs the state to register those who marry abroad as married. So you can fly to the United States, get married, and have that marriage, get married in a civil court, and have that marriage recognized by the State of Israel, at least since 1963. Common law marriage over the decades, Israel court system established it at the top of Western countries regarding common law marriage. Common law marriage is, of course, you don't do anything, but you're just considered a couple by living together, etc. Israel has one of the most complete and progressive common law marriage laws, and of course, because some people cannot get married in Israel in their own state. Like, let's say if you're a Jew and a Christian, you cannot get married in Israel because the Chief Rabbinate is not going to perform that marriage. Or if you're a Kohen and a divorcee, you cannot get married in Israel because it's orthodoxly forbidden. So basically, you're two citizens of the state and you just can't get married. So for these cases and others, common law marriage, if you're common law marriage, you get almost as much rights as other marriages in Israel. In 2006, the Supreme Court instructs the state to register same-sex couples as married. Of course, same-sex couples can't get married through the Chief Rabbinate. 1913, the law is amended and decrees up to 2 years in prison for halachic wedding outside of the Chief Rabbinate. So if you are performing a chuppah, Orthodox chuppah, outside of the Chief Rabbinate, not registering in the Chief Rabbinate, you are a criminal and you can get up to 2 years in prison for that. Now, I'm just going to say straight off, this law is not enforced, and I guess will never be enforced because everybody understands that it's completely ludicrous. But this is the law in Israel. Now, so and up to this point, we've seen how the status quo is formed, and now we will see how it is basically deconstructed. In the 1990s, shopping malls began opening on the Sabbath. At the same time, 24/7 convenience stores pop up, also working on the Sabbath. In 1994, shared taxis on the Sabbath received legal legitimation, so it's a sort of public transportation on the Sabbath. And today, there is no major city in Israel without many cinema houses open on the Sabbath, including Jerusalem, right? So the struggle for opening of cinemas on the Sabbath is over. And here, I bring a headline of a newspaper. This is a historic day. Tel Avivians hope buses on the Sabbath are just the beginning. Tel Aviv municipality funds buses that don't take money on the Sabbath. So it's legal because it's not public transportation that you need to buy a ticket for, but it is public transportation on the Sabbath that the municipality funds. And this is just a list of all the different malls opened on the Sabbath, every Sabbath in Israel today. So concerning Sabbath, the public sphere in Israel has gone through a great process of liberalization, basically. Capitalism does that. And so all these malls either try to go around the law through different loopholes or sometimes break the law. break the law and the law can be enforced, and mostly it's not enforced, and they don't even get fined for opening on the Sabbath. Most people are for public transportation on the Sabbath. I bring this survey from 2018, right? 45% want public transportation, but limited. 27% want it just like any other day, even though it's Sabbath. And this, I already showed you the struggle right now for the metro in Tel Aviv to work on the Sabbath. Now, kashrut. I'm not going to go on to all these details, but these are headlines that show struggles to open up the kashrut markets, to have other institutes grant certifications for kashrut that are not the Chief Rabbinate. And as I said, you cannot write that your cafe is kosher without paying the Chief Rabbinate and having the Chief Rabbinate inspect it. But so here, if you can see here, I'm going to try to marker it, just a second. Here you can see the Sohar Rabbinical Institute will give out Sohar food supervision notices. They're not using the word kosher because it's trademarked for the Chief Rabbinate. And indeed, in the last government, in the Bennett-Lapid government, they worked through a whole renovation or reform of the kashrut system. Bennett here in this tweet is saying, for decades, everyone talked about corruption, the culture of jobs. That means giving your nephew a job as a kashrut inspector, etc. And the exorbitant prices in the kashrut system, but did nothing. The Minister of Religion, Matan Kahana, arrived and performed. That's it. There is competition in kosher regulation. That's how we work. And what they did is open kosher regulation to each municipal rabbi. Each municipal rabbi working through the Chief Rabbinate, but now could issue their own kashrut certificate. And that was sort of breaking the monopoly of the Chief Rabbinate. But the first order of business of the new government, this current government, was to cancel that reform in kashrut. And this is another point where the cultural struggle in Israel is heating up right now. A little kosher data, 48% of Jews are keeping kosher basically everywhere. I'm sure they're not, obeying all the little points of detail in the halakha, but basically they keep kosher. But 52% saying abolish the Chief Rabbinate's kosher monopoly. So people are keeping kosher, but they are sensitive enough. They're noticing that the Chief Rabbinate's kosher monopoly is not getting us to anywhere good. It's full of corruption and indeed is a strain on the system in Israel. Marriage secularization. I'm bringing you a headline from 2019. Fewer Israelis marrying through the Chief Rabbinate report shows the Minister of Religious Services attribute the drop to general changes in marriage trends. However, the report is evidence of a growing contempt in Israel towards the rabbinate and the power it wields. People are marrying less and less through the Chief Rabbinate. The logos I bring here on the right are NGOs offering to perform chuppahs or marriage ceremonies, Jewish marriage ceremonies, either halachic or non-halachic, outside of the Chief Rabbinate. These ceremonies are not recognized by the state, but you can have a ceremony in your own liking, in your own design, not with an Orthodox, usually Ultra-Orthodox rabbi from the Chief Rabbinate. And again, if you're doing it halachically, it's illegal. But okay. Support for all types of marriage. As you can see, support for all types of marriage has grown year after year in Israel. In 2018, 70% of Jews in Israel supported all types of marriage, meaning civil marriage and LGBT marriage. right, in Israel. Now that percentage has gone down a bit. Today, I'm bringing you the data from 2022. Today, 62% supported. It's still a very robust majority of Jewish Israelis supporting all types of marriage. And again, legally, we don't have that in Israel. And I want to bring another piece of interesting data. Assuming these options were available, which would you choose for yourself or your children? As you can see, almost half of Israelis would still choose to get married orthodoxly through the Chief Rabbinate, probably, right? But they still can support having civil marriage and LGBT marriage in Israel for anyone who wants that. The fact that these people are traditional does not obstruct them for vying for freedom of religion for others. So I will now, in this part of the presentation, I want to ask, how did we get from this to this, right? From Tel Aviv asking people to be considerate and not desecrate the Sabbath in public, to these shopping malls open every Sabbath in Israel. Well, obviously, this is connected to something that we talked about, I think, in the last week, right? The change in the society in Israel to a much more diverse society, to a much more individualistic society in which people are basically engaging with tradition on their own terms. They are no longer secular, but different sorts of secular. They can be also, they can join the reform or the conservative movements. They can be any type of New Age Judaism sort of Jews, and there can be many different kinds. And so we're talking about the Jewish Renaissance, in which Jews are individually engaging with their tradition, and if so, they can be very, they can have a lot of respect and for the tradition, but still engage with tradition in a privatized way and be very tolerant to other types of observance of the tradition. I have here data about Israelis' beliefs, right? 80% of Israelis believe there is a God. 80% believe there is a reward for good deeds. 77% that there is divine force directing the world. This is data from 2009, but I'm bringing it to show that the Israeli society is a traditional society. It's a society that is in many ways religious. But again, this religion doesn't obstruct it, or this respect for religion or respect for tradition does not obstruct it from being pluralistic and tolerant enough to entertain different forms of Judaism, etc. But I will say, something is happening these very days that has put this tolerance in tension. And what happened is what I showed you in the beginning, and I'm going to go over it quickly right now. Basically, the struggle for the soul of Israel, as we talked about last time, between a more ethnocentric and traditional, and I would say orthodox political cluster, and a more liberal and secular political cluster on the other side. And I want to show how this figures out in the political map in Israel. These are the current political parties in Israel. We've got, let me show you with a little marker here for a minute. Yeah. This is religious Zionism, Minister of Finance Smotrich party. These are the two ultra-Orthodox parties, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi. This is the Likud. This is Israel Beitenu, Lieberman's party, Machaneh Mamlachti. This is Gantz. This is Lapid's Yesh Atid, the labor movement, and Meretz, which is not in parliament now because it didn't reach the threshold of votes needed to get into parliament. Now, I've divided this political map into the right and the left, and secular and religious. Okay, so as you can see, most parties here are on the secular side, and a few parties are on the religious side. Bear in mind, this does not give you the size of the parties in terms of votes, right? This cluster here is about half the votes in Israel, right? This is the government right now. So this is not votes, but this is how the political map divides itself. But what has happened over the last, I would say even 2 years, is that the Likud has taken upon itself a more traditional and even, I would say, religious identity. The Likud has basically moved in this map rightwards and religious words. So the map right now is about this, is displaying the political spectrum between a more secular, not only leftwards, but more secular cluster and a more religious cluster here, right? The Likud has become a much more religious party, and indeed Netanyahu in the Likud is probably the most secular person there. The leader of the Likud is probably the most secular person. And here, I want to bring you to a tweet by Netanyahu and an election ad by Lieberman. Lieberman in his election ad says, yes to a Jewish state, no to a halachic state, playing on the tension between the Jewish identity that obviously his voters want and the halachic identity or the halachic position for the public sphere that his voters fear. And Netanyahu is saying Israel will not be a halachic state, will not be a theocracy, as in trying to calm his potential voters down and saying, don't worry, I'm not going to let the religious parties around me decide the character of Israel. I want to show you, and this is really, and I will perhaps open for questions after this. This is a tweet by Netanyahu, by the Prime Minister of Israel, from 3 days ago. And Netanyahu is tweeting, the state of Israel is a free country where no one will limit who gets on public transportation and will not dictate where she or he sits. Whoever does this breaks the law and must be punished for it. This is Netanyahu 3 days ago, after understanding that that this tension in Israel right now is politically dangerous for him, right? Now he's saying this while in the coalition agreements for this very government that he has signed only half a year ago, he promised the religious parties in Israel that gender segregation will be possible in the public sphere in Israel. They demanded it and he agreed to it. So now he's a bit backtracking and saying, don't worry, women will be able to board buses and sit wherever they want, even under my government. So let me sum up things, and I will stop the presentation now. On the one hand, over the last 30 years, Israel has gone through a great process of liberalization, and the public sphere has become much more, in a way, liberal. There are many shops open on the Sabbath. You can get married in many different ways, even though some of them will not be registered in the state and are considered illegal. But the options are there, much more than before. And kosher-wise, people are are antagonistic towards the Chief Rabbinates and its kosher law. laws also, and it's marriage laws, and there are other options opening up. On the other hand, this government specifically has escalated tensions around religion and state issues in a way that I would say is unprecedented. So while the status quo, Ben-Gurion's old promises to Agudat Israel, has basically broken down, the status quo is no longer viable in Israel, and nobody even really wants it, except perhaps the Ultra-Orthodox. Well, that is broken down. Tensions in the Israeli society at this point are really in an unprecedented height with issues of religion and state. And indeed, next Thursday, I think, there's going to be a demonstration of women in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. So secular women are going to go into ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods as part of the protest against the judicial overhaul and protest themselves, protest women being free in the public sphere. This is what things have come to in Israel right now. And I want to open up for questions in the remaining time that we have.
Thank you. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. One note that was in the news as well was Tisha B'Av, where apparently, I don't know if it's all of Israel, but certainly you're not supposed to open your restaurants on Tisha B'Av in Israel. And people generally, they may open it, they may not, but they don't do it publicly. But this year, I understand from articles I read that restaurants went out of their way to advertise they would be open on Tisha B'Av. So that creates another issue, right?
Right. So, so legally, it's not allowed to open restaurants. Restaurants in Tel Aviv have been opening up over the last decade, I would say. But this year, they're not only opening up, but they're advertising that they are on purpose. They're purposely opening up and, shunning Tisha B'Av. Again, this is obviously part of the culture war going on in Israel right now.
Rabbi Dennis Linson, who's a supporter of CSP from his Temple Judea of Laguna Woods, he said that Rabbi Chayun, a Masorti rabbi in Haifa, was arrested for performing a chuppah. He was released, but he was arrested. So I think that's something to note, that it does happen. And I think people are scared about doing that and not making it too public.
Well, I wouldn't say that people are scared. Again, the law won't be enforced. And I personally have performed quite a number of chuppahs in my time. I don't think it's a real danger. But the very fact that you're a criminal for orthodoxly performing a chuppah in Israel is the absurd and ludicrous thing.
There is a question that has come up, which is obviously the people protesting right now are protesting about the judicial change on a very high level. But are they also, you said that there's going to be a protest in Haredi neighborhoods. I'm not sure that's a great idea, but is the issue about this turn to the right in religious restrictions, is that also a major issue within the broad spectrum of Israeli society? Is it as big as the judicial issue, or is it just part of the whole, what's going on?
With the religion.
Right. In other words, if the government didn't go out and try to restrict the rules of the court, but focused on these religious restrictions, would there be as much pushback in the general society as we're seeing right now?
No. This question is really theoretical because the judicial overhaul is meant, from the point of view of ultra-Orthodox parties and the religious Zionist party in government today, is meant to allow religious coercion and to allow gender segregation in the public sphere, which the Supreme Court would not allow if it has its power. So the judicial overhaul is part of this. The judicial overhaul is meant to neutralize, or neuter really, the power of the Supreme Court in order for laws to be legislated that allow for religious coercion and gender segregation, discrimination of women, that the Supreme Court would not be able to strike down.
Arnold Sugarman asks, so how do these laws affect non-Jews in Israel? So if you're a Christian or a Muslim, can you open your restaurant on Shabbat?
Yes.
Can you
So,
travel? Can you do certain things? Anyway, that's the question.
yeah, you can. Yeah, I mean, there is exemptions for people who are not Jewish. This is one of the loopholes that was around the pork, the forbidding of raising of pork in Israel. Arabs, Christian Arabs, obviously not Muslims who wouldn't want to, but Christian Arabs could raise pork, and so kibbutzim, had a collective businesses with the Christian Arabs in Israel to raise pork. So yeah, basically, they obviously these people also don't marry through the chief rabbinates. They have their own religious authorities, and yes, and so they have an exemption from all these.
But they go to hospitals in Israel, so I assume their bags are being checked for chametz as well.
Yeah. I mean, bag checking, I don't know if it will return next year because of the uproar that was this year, but yeah, they would have their bags checked. Yeah, I guess, I mean, in some points there is a conflict there with these people's religion. And of course, obviously secular Jews also, I mean, they're for some reason, they're not considered being of a different religion because they're Jewish, but obviously they don't believe that they shouldn't eat chametz on Pesach.
Nancy asked a question. She's been reading that UTJ, United Torah, I guess, which is in the coalition, according to what she's reading, is getting nervous about judicial reform, and they feel that this has escalated the culture war against Haredim. And that they may leave the coalition, which would then, I assume, crash the coalition. So her question is this something really going on that she's been reading about in the news? What's your thought as to, and what happens if they do pull out of the coalition?
Yes, they're nervous. Will they pull out of the coalition? No, not because of this, not because of their nervousness. Yes, the Ultra-Orthodox are finally noticing that a lot of the public anger about the judicial overhaul is directed to them. I mean, and again, not for no reason. And they are worried of a backlash that if the next government will not be a Netanyahu government, there will be a backlash, and some legislation will be pointed against them. So they are now trying to say, we actually don't want this judicial overhaul at all. We just want our little stuff. Please exempt us from army service, and that's it. And they're trying to backtrack. I don't think it's really working for them because I think it's a bit too late. But will they leave the coalition over this? I would say no, only if the coalition fails to deliver for them what they want, which is an exemption from army service legislation.
You talked a little about gay rights in Israel, and it's considered a very liberal place, particularly in the Middle East. But again, there's a culture war going on there because Jerusalem is very different from Tel Aviv. So you can have a march, I guess, a very successful one in Tel Aviv, but in Jerusalem, there's been challenges. Has there been legislation, or is there anything going on now with regard to pulling back? Okay, the irony is, look, we live in America, and look what's happened here, right? Yeah. A very for political purposes, the Republican Party has linked itself to, a very traditional conservative Christian right wing. It's allowed for restrictions on women's rights. Because of certain change in the Supreme Court. So and books are being taken out of our schools. We're seeing the culture war here. It's not like we can look in Israel and point our finger. We're seeing it here, and I assume it's part of what you talked about around the world. It's part of this populist reaction to change. So it is a big challenge, but I'm wondering, and we've seen, and now people feel that gay rights will be retrenched here in the United States. Is that happening in Israel as well?
So in Israel, the situation is opposite. The Supreme Court is the place, or is the institute that granted LGBTs basically all the rights they have in Israel. I mean, it opened up marriage for them, and different fertilization processes, etc. And if the judicial overhaul succeeds, there is a fear that legislation will come about that narrows down LGBT rights. Right now, nothing has changed. for LGBTs, except the public atmosphere, which from the government side is very antagonistic towards LGBTs, and people have said some awful things. I mean, I will just give an example. The chairman, it's not the head, but the chairman of the Ultra-Orthodox party, Agudat Israel, said that LGBTs are more dangerous to Israel than Hezbollah and Iran, right? This is a sort of a comment that we hear from government right now.
Okay. Let's end with a question or note from Marjorie. And she says, well, if we look at the IDF is not a religious organization. It's probably mostly secular. And we are now seeing like this pushback from the defense force to what's going on. So her question is, will there come a time when, she says, they rebel at defending people who don't serve, who don't pay taxes, who are trying to take away their rights, who are trying to enforce religion on them or other people? What's your perspective as to what may be happening or may happen?
When we talk about the IDF, we need to differentiate between two things: the actual army right now serving in uniform, and the huge amount of Israelis which are reserve forces, which are civilians. And they're not in uniform now, but they have served. Maybe they have been officers, maybe even high-ranking officers. And this second group is one of the main groups now organized in demonstrations and protests against the government. And they are doing some very serious things to disrupt the government and try to organize a resistance to it. The IDF specifically right now on uniform, of course, can't do anything like that. So there's no, I don't think there's any realistic danger for it actually rebelling and overthrowing the government, God forbid, or anything like that. But again, in Israel, remember, most of the IDF is not in the IDF right now. Most are reserve forces, and they are doing exactly that. They are demanding that the parts of the Israeli public, the Jewish Israeli public that have not served, will not decide for them even on the character of the public sphere in Israel.
So we end on quite a happy note.
I will say another thing.
Yes.
To end, also to be a bit optimistic. We are at a point of great tension in the cultural war in Israel. But what I have brought to you, the data that I have brought to you, remember, also shows that most Israelis, while being traditional, are also very tolerant and pluralistic towards other types of Jewish expression and civil marriage, etc. So underneath the heated emotions right now is a great mass of Israelis that can be very attached to tradition, but also very tolerant. And they're still there. The current government has brought this issue into conflation, but it doesn't have to be so. I don't think a compromise in many different issues cannot be reached by a different constellation of political forces.
So I guess let me end with a different question. And Nancy actually put it in the chat, but it's something I was thinking as well. There is going to be a new government because these governments don't last. I don't know when this government will fall or fail, but it will happen probably within 8 months or so is my guess, but I have no idea. When the new government comes in, the judgment is it's going to be a very different government because the Israeli population has seen what happens. Is that government then going to backlash against the Haredim, against the settlers, against what they've seen happen? Or do you think it's going to be a moderate government to try to heal the country?
There's no contradiction there. It can be a moderate government in terms of its makeup, in terms of its parties, but backlash is going to happen for sure. I mean, there are going to be forces in parliament that will demand it, and I don't think any government, except another Netanyahu government, will be able to resist some action against the ultra-Orthodox. I mean, when we say against, it's really just making them pay their fair share of duties and taxes. It's not more than that. And perhaps a liberalization of the public sphere further liberalization of the public sphere. I don't see a different government that doesn't go there. So, I mean, and I don't see a chance for a secular party, a militantly secular party not running in the next elections. I'm sure that will happen. Lieberman will probably also enhance his secular militancy. So, yeah, I mean, there will be a backlash. Question is when and I mean, when will this government fall? And I don't know right now.
Okay. Well, thank you for another terrific program in our series about the dynamic interplay between religion, state, and national identity in Israel. Next week, in our final part of the series, we focus on Jewish nationalism in the Temple Mount, which was in the news as well, because we just had a visit there, I believe, recently. Was it Smotrich who went up there?
Ben-Gurion.
Ben-Gurion went up there. So thank you all for joining us today and for studying this great topic, learning more about it, being involved, being in the know. So when people ask you questions, you will have some great data and information to share. We'll send some follow-up reading as well. Take care. Have a nice Shabbat, everybody. If you're coming to CBI for the installation for Rabbi Adam and Cantor Amy, look forward to seeing you there. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.